Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the 51st Martin Center Research Seminar Series. This seminar is hosted and supported by the Martin Center for Architectural and Urban Studies at the University of Cambridge. The new series has successfully kicked off a week ago with particular focus on architecture and energy. Today, we have invited Dr. Patrick Lynch to share his research on discourse and discipline, the civic ground and mimesis in architecture. I am Yue, one of the co-runners of the seminar series this year, and my colleague Nacha is working with me today to broadcast the seminar. We will open the channel for questions after the seminar. There are several options to interact with our speakers. You may either raise your hand by clicking on the button on the screen, and our conveners will invite you to the panel. Don't forget to unmute yourself. Please notice that the talk today is live streamed on Facebook until the beginning of the Q&A, which won't be recorded on our YouTube channel. So please rest assured and join our discussion later. Now I would like to hand over to Nacha to introduce our speaker and chair the session today. Nacha.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Yue. It is an honor for me today to introduce Patrick to you. So Dr. Patrick Lynch is the founding director of Lynch Architects, who have won a number of awards, including the Young Architect of the Year in 2005 and the World Architecture Festival Best Office Building in 2016. Current projects include offices, a public library at Victoria in central London, and a housing project for Hackney Council at Hoxton. Patrick studied architecture and architectural history at Liverpool and Cambridge universities. He completed a PhD at London Metropolitan University in 2015, where his dissertation, Practical Poetics, Rhythmic Spatiality and the Communicative Movement Between Architecture, Sculpture, and Site, was supervised by Peter Carl, Helen Mollinson, and Joseph Brickworth. This became two books, one of which is Civic Ground, published in 2017, and the other is Mimesis, which was published in 2015. His MPhil dissertation was also published as a book. Its title is The Theatricality of the Baroque City. This was published in 2011. Patrick is also a poet. He was shortlisted for the Britport Prize last year. In addition to this, he has taught at a number of schools of architecture, including Cambridge, the AA, the CAS, Kingston, and UCD. And since 2016, he has been an honorary professor at the University of Liverpool. Today, Patrick is going to address the tension between architectural discourse and discipline, and suggest that not only is this tension inevitable, but also that it is wise for both practitioners and academics to acknowledge the limits of both. Now, Patrick, I hand over to you for your talk, Discourse and Discipline on Civic Ground and Mimesis in Architecture.
Hi, thanks, Nacha. Thanks very much for having me. Should I try and share the screen now? How is that? Can you see this?
It's not full screen.
Ah, okay. What do I do? Yeah, you have to tell me what to do. You share. Yeah. How's that?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, moving. I'm gonna talk to you about some projects in London, and so I'm gonna just situate us. This is the River Thames, obviously. This is Green Park and the House of Parliament, and Victoria here, and Victoria Park, and Hoxton and Hackney here. And I'm just going to start by showing you, if you know, part of what I'm going to be talking to you about is topography. Another way to think about the topics that I'm engaged with might be fruitfully described in this diagram, which I rather pretentiously called an academic topology, whereby a kind of Platonic cosmos or cosmology is kind of described, whereby architecture is both concerned with the natural conditions and, of course, with form and ideas. And in my conception of Civic Ground, it's a kind of horizon that sits between these two poles, whereby, if you like, the discipline and discourse of architecture kind of come together in the way in which Le Corbusier was very fond of emphasizing kind of reciprocity between material thought and metaphor. And broadly speaking, I'm kind of at the moment engaged in looking at relationships between the domestic territory and the public life of cities, and calling the place where they intersect and engage with each other civic ground. And so you can see that within there's kind of tectonics and craft and mimesis are kind of part of a sort of imaginative territory. And that understanding of the relationship between intuition, imagination, and reason is kind of pretty much standard throughout Western metaphysics. This is a diagram from a recent study about artificial intelligence, intelligence and spirit, which pretty much kind of sees the problem of artificial intelligence as the fact that, to quote Herbert Dreyfus, wrote this wonderful book, What Computers Still Can't Do. There's nothing artificial about intelligence. And I guess you could argue that there is this tension, however, between reason and understanding and comprehension and communication of ideas and the messy, strange, mixed experience that we all have, both as writers and as designers. I've been kind of fruitful over the past decade or so, whereby academic work that was, as Nacho alluded to, begun at Cambridge 26 years ago, in fact, a kind of hermeneutic art historical reading of a festival place in Dresden, the Swinger, became a book which was looking at the relationship between the topography of the city and the ephemeral character of rock festivals. And I guess that the work I'm doing now is really being driven by practice. This is this kind of shelf in the studio. This is the view out of our window from our meeting room. And there's a kind of constellation of, obviously technological things, computers, artworks, lots of books. This is kind of where I'm sitting, looking what I can see now, the kind of horizon on which work that exists in theoretical, kind of theoretical state, and work which is being made are kind of coming together. And part of the output of the office now is books that not books that I've written solely, but also books that I'm publishing. A journal of civic architecture, which is a kind of space of dialogue, I guess, kind of partly friends made through Venice Biennale participations and Instagram, Twitter, that kind of broader network of relationships. And we've made 3 books so far. If we have enough time at the end of the talk, maybe I could go into some detail about these books, and we could begin a discussion about them. These books grew out of teaching a decade or so ago at London Met, a diploma studio, where part of the final year and diploma modules was design research and then design realization, and we found ourselves looking into things like Tavora and Caesar's work, the students naturally making them into books, and then kind of engaging in interviewing Caesar in this case. So there's a kind of attempt to make master's level design studio work a sort of preparation for proper graduate research, held in tension, however, with the material world. So this investigations into the work of Caesar and Tavora, etc., was complemented by these physical models and physical models of the city, which had a kind of typological, analogical reading of the relationship between making and technology. So this was kind of going on when the project which Joseph Rigver and Dalibor Vesely had instigated at the University of Essex in the 1960s which had migrated to Cambridge in the 1980s, and then kind of with Delabor's retirement and Peter's moving to the CAS, or London Met, led to quite a fruitful relationship between the design studio. I think it was helped by the fact that if in a kind of series of strange circumstances, Cambridge didn't have a RIBA Part 2 course at the time, and the Royal College had a very small one. So a lot of the Cambridge students were migrating to London Met because of Peter, and because of people like Alan Jones and I, and David Grandwatch and others who'd studied in the department, who were running a kind of, I suppose, kind of peripatetic kind of adjunct to the Essex Cambridge course. Peter's now gone to Harvard, and it's kind of dissipated to some degree. There are, however, people like Matthew Barrack and Christian Frost and Nick Temple within the PhD seminar at the CAS. And it was quite a kind of fecund period. I was invited to participate by David Chipperfield in the Venice Biennale in 2012, and we made a 1:3 scale model along with Eric Parry and Howard Tompkins of some of our buildings, and presented a kind of manifesto for what I started to realize might be best described as civic architecture. And this exhibition came back to London, and then instigated a seminar at the AA where I'd used to teach. And we were looking at Victoria Street in particular. I think one reason why I decided to do a PhD in later kind of middle age was that I felt this opportunity that we won this competition to do a block of flats and an office building, an enormous jump for a small practice, and that I really needed to understand the situation that I was working in. And this is the view from just outside the entrance to Westminster School by the Abbey, looking west down Victoria Street. It's changed a bit now, but it's typified by this kind of bizarre juxtaposition of a kind of disciplined functionalist modernity with Hawksmoor's kind of weirdly symmetrical Baroque Gothic festive facade of the Abbey, and this building, which is now no longer there, which was part of a triumvirate of buildings, this being Westminster City Hall, a kind of denial of the natural hinterland of the city, and these kind of strange new buildings, which seem to be different in part to the 60s objects, but not actually that much different from each other. They didn't have much in common with this stuff of Frank Matcham theatre. And in fact, I'm not going to kind of labour this point, and maybe we can discuss it afterwards. At that time, the Martin Centre, Leslie Martin and Lionel March were actually working on a project to knock down most of Whitehall and to replace it with a kind of city, I guess, or a bureaucratic city. And that approach didn't get built, and yet there was a kind of, I think, necessity for me to intellectually to try to understand the things that I inherited. That despite the extreme lack of porosity to the foreground, there is actually quite a lot of depth, or civic depth, as Peter Carl calls it. This is the Catholic Cathedral. There's a kind of quasi pseudo Victorian monastic hinterland of things, and a kind of early 19th century kind of domestic civic grandeur, if you like. And in fact, even the late modernist buildings had a kind of porous relationship to the city, even though the language of the buildings was in the case of on the building on the left, a kind of homage to Mies van der Rohe. In fact, they got a license to borrow some of his details. It has an urban grain which is not North American, and which is has much more in common with Wellington House, the Royal Academy, and the things we saw one can see on Piccadilly. So the study for Venice Biennale, which was part of the research for the PhD, was looking at this relationship between Victoria Street and Piccadilly, and looking at clues for how the cross grain of connections. This is just not a particularly good building, but it's the Church of Christian Scientists, which backs onto Piccadilly, and then just by Green Park, has a kind of situatedness and orientation. And the more I began to think about the differences between the modernist situation that I inherited and the traditional city, although it's hardly traditional, it's in the 19th century at best, it's kind of analogical. I started to realize that by putting civic in front of architecture, it orients it. And my frustrations with a lot of very introverted functionalist, and also I guess one could argue kind of parametric design, is that it doesn't really seem to have any civic dimensionality or any depth. And so I'm going to give you a few examples of my argument. The first is the Scuola Grande di San Rocco, which is two buildings, a chapel and a guild. The ceiling of the upper floor of the guild is beautifully painted by Tiepolo. It's a kind of grand public room. The landscaping of the city is oriented actually around this temporary event of this festive curtains that commemorates the feast of Saint Roche. And then a grand house on the Grand Canal, Venice de Cadoro, a grand merchant's house with a river gate, a water gate, and domestic quarters at the top of the house. It's a very interesting building. It's domestic, but it's clearly civic. It's designed for a wealthy family to participate in the civic life of the water-based festivals of the city. It's also a kind of solar screen. It's a psychological buffer as well. It allows you to be more or less in public, and also to have a face. And that kind of understanding really of architecture as being absolutely rooted in the city really has its origins in Alberti's work. Interestingly, you probably know he was a lawyer by training and a papal envoy, and wrote two books. The first book was about the family, and another book was called the Vita Civile, books about Florence before he became an architect. And one of his first commissions was for this grand palazzo. In fact, really what it is the amalgamation of a series of houses and a actually not finished facade, but the addition of a stoa from which the family and the ritualized could watch a procession from the River Arno to Piazza della Repubblica and then Piazza della Santa Croce was his way of saying, look, quite clearly, if you want to be praised and you want to be seen as glorious, you need to be virtuous. And so the architecture becomes this way for a family and a city to reconcile the introverted aspects of domestic life with the city. And I suppose that the most obvious example, which I could think of to demonstrate my point, is Michelangelo's project for the Campaglio. He inherited this building and this building. In the late Middle Ages, the burghers of Rome started to use this as a, sorry, I don't know why if you can see that, to use this building as a town hall. This is Paolo Portuguese's really interesting formal analysis of the eccentric placement of this equine statue of Marcus Aurelius in the square. But really, what's lacking in that type of drawing is an understanding that in fact it's topography, and that really the view from the upper part of the tower of the new town hall orients you back towards the Vatican, and on the other side towards the Roman city. So in effect, it's ground and it's civic, and this kind of embodied and material physical character of architecture, as well as its representational and its situational, is really what I think is lacking in a lot of modern architecture today, and also in a lot of modern architectural discourse. However, it's not fair to say that it was completely lacking within modern architecture. This is a very interesting tripartite city block additions by Avarauto. This is Esplanadi, the Strand in central Helsinki. This is retail and offices, an apartment building, and then a bookshop. So on one side you see quite a staid elevation. This is this thing here. There's a pedestrian passage linking them with a residential entrance and the bookshop here. So the architecture is similar, but it subtly adjusts itself in terms of program and in terms of situation. So on the elevation on Esplanadi, he adds, in imitation of, or mimetic imitation, as it were, that's not a tautology, of the stucco architecture of the Grand Boulevard, these white surrounds to the facade of the building. I think that's probably why Avarauto was Robert Venturi's favourite architect. And this is inside the bookshop, where there's a kind of beautiful metaphor for, it's the university academic bookshop, so of knowledge as enlightenment, and light as this kind of crystalline figure, both kind of functionally dropping light into the space and emblematic of a kind of erudite understanding of the decor and ornament of a room. This is the book. I'm not going to talk to you a lot about this because it kind of, it's in effect a sort of historiography or trajectory of that type of thinking, and put very simply, up until very recently, architectural treatise, the kind of discourse of architecture, was always making a distinction between the civil or the civic and the militaristic, and in fact, one could even read situations such as the temporary camp that was known as the jungle in Calais for refugees as having a kind of civic order, because they had both a domestic hinterland and a high street with temporary mosques and churches. And in contrast to that kind of rich understanding of the relationship between type and program, a lot of the work that came out of the Martin Centre's PhD students, including Peter Eisenman and Colin Rose, kind of mentoring of him, is disembodied and desituated. And a lot of work of fellow graduates of the Rick Vesley seminar, including David Leatherbarrow at Penn, has been to try to re-embed Palladio in particular, who Eisenman kind of desituated back into the political civic terrain of Vicenza. So obviously the rhythmic asymmetry of the new facade of the basilica of the town hall, it has to do with a reconciliation of the kind of economic use of the medieval building on which is paying for the new town hall. In effect, the communicative movement that the title of the book refers to, in a nutshell, as Dalibor Wesley would say, has to do with the fact that this is an example of the ceiling, another ceiling by Tiepolo in the Bishop's Palace in Würzburg, where the kind of Christian universe of the heavens is ordered and brought down to earth by at that point 4 continents, and you can only really understand the relationship between the material physical world and the gods as you ascend this staircase. So in effect, what Wesley is arguing is that architecture has this very strong cultural role to play, whereby it situates us in relationship to history, and in relationship to geography, and in relationship to time. And these are, I won't go into more detail, but these are the sort of thing that Peter Carl uses in his PhD and master seminars. So it's kind of articulation and embodiment, if you like. And with that intellectual schema, I was able to trace the development of ideas of spatiality in the 20th century from Adolf Appiah and Delacroix's Eurythmia in Hellerau outside Dresden, via a kind of reading of the role of nature and time in Renaissance ornament. You've seen this already. And my thesis really was that this kind of way of thinking survives in the 20th century very powerfully in land art, in particular in the work of Chilida, who trained as an architect, his project for the Wincombes. Then via people like Rudolf Schwarz's influence upon Sigurd Leverance, whereby even in a Lutheran Protestant situation where there's no iconography or no pictorial content, there is nonetheless a kind of spatial structure. There's a cross on a hill, and a conch shell, which is in Renaissance paintings a symbol of the unification of the Virgin Mary and Venus as Mother Nature, brought together at a certain point where effectively a kind of theatricality of spatial situations reveals the relationship between myth and topography. So as you go to take communion, the light comes in through the south at noon. The west gate is opened, and the rolling clouds within the vaults of the Catalan vaults of the brick ceiling reveal themselves, in fact, to be a metaphor or symbolic of the sky itself, reflected in the pool outside. So the essential kind of structure of the myth of Christianity, that God becomes man, and then man dies and Christ becomes God again. And through the celebration of the Mass, the sacrifice of Christ, we are redeemed and gain eternal life. It's kind of spatialized, and even to the extent that these three funny shaped lamps outside, in my reading of it, are Christ and the two thieves kind of hanging. And in a more obviously kind of Catholic content, this relationship between geography, mythology, the cult of the Virgin Mary that coincides in Portuguese culture with travel overseas. So Mares becomes Maria, becomes homesickness, becomes a kind of watery Venetian Venusian grotto, and the placement of a sculpture of the Virgin Mary in relationship to the natural world kind of informed then the work I was doing as an architect. This is a project for a competition that we won for the refurbishment of Westminster Cathedral Piazza, and we proposed a baldacchino in honour of, it's now St. John Henry Newman, which is a projection of the rhythm of the colonnade that runs between the nave and the apse inside the church into the piazza. So a kind of spatializing of rhythmic relationships. This is the office building that won the award that Nacha mentioned, next to the town hall. So it's replacing what was a gap, a kind of a blockage with a gap and a space. And in effect, the civic situation of the town hall as the tallest building, but also one with this kind of portico, which allows a kind of public life to occur around it, became the conclusion of the PhD, an attempt to show how solar shading and kind of human ecology could be understood to work together. And Mimesis, its counterpart, is a book which is kind of how-to. So it's a kind of practical version thereof, whereby things that I'd seen and things that I'd absorbed as an architect kind of placed into juxtaposition with a kind of historical sensibility to time, similar to Abby Warburg's Mesonomy Atlas. Incidentally, when we did this book with Artifice, the publisher said it was the first time, having done 3,000 books with artists and architects, that anybody was prepared to show anybody else's work in their book, which I think is a kind of indication of a lack of civic mindedness within our profession. The book's also about the physical aspects of mimesis, whereby the mimosa plant, as we know, kind of tracks and follows the sun. So and the way we learn to imitate, both as poets or as architects, is physical. So we learn to draw like someone we admire, we learn to play football like someone we want to admire, we learn to dance, we learn to use our bodies, we learn to talk, we learn the language of architecture, I argue, through intensely physical engagement with the subject. So the book is a kind of record of the process of design of some buildings. Just to kind of demonstrate how this methodology might be something which can become instrumentalized, in the last issue of The Joker, I looked at two schools of architecture by Tavora and Caesar, and in particular this drawing by Caesar, which is published in his recent book called Indiscipline, where he's kind of making an argument. It's a exhibition catalogue, but he's effectively arguing that architecture is both discipline and indiscipline. Now, this is the new school of architecture. This is the second year pavilion, and this is an old villa in a walled garden. And the plan that he generates, the geometry that forms the relationships between the various parts, is situated in a non-perspectival way. So it's outside of your field of vision. You can't see where it is, but everything is constructed and related to this point that you sense with your body. And my argument is that the city of Porto, it's a port city, this is a kind of standard tourist photograph, has on its hill the Bishop's Palace, the cathedral, the 19th century city, and at its heart is kind of economic topography of ramps for barrels to be taken on and off of boats. And so my argument is, in effect, that what they called the House of Architecture in the publication that the school made about the project, Caesar is doing is, in a microcosm, he's condensing the geography of the city, which on the one side has these villas of Villanova de Gaia, the port wine lodges, and the topography of the old port city itself, into a school of architecture which is mimetic of the topography of the city. So there's a series of villas and there's a series of wharfs. And in fact, this is the chimney to the boiler room. You enter through this tiny gateway, and they have a ceremony every year where they christen the architecture students and get them very drunk, which is a kind of inversion of the Red Villa in the original walled garden. And my argument is that what he's doing, and he's written about it quite extensively, is a kind of analogical architecture. So it's a homage both to Aldo Rossi's kind of proletariat architecture, and also in the library to his beloved Avarauto. So he's effectively saying that there's this discipline of architecture which begins with drawing, and there's this discourse of architecture which begins with reading, and that is a methodology in itself for the teaching of Portuguese architects. You see it in other projects, the Gallery of Contemporary Art in Santiago de la Compostela is a kind of condensation of the topography of the city. And in fact, if you go to the Porto school, you see they set these projects to the students. So there's an attempt to create a kind of way to understand how to read architecture and how to make architecture. So the discipline of architecture and the discourse of architecture are sort of united in a fruitful way. Now, the last part of the talk, I'm going to kind of run through quickly in a bit more detail, some of the built work and some of the things we're doing at the moment. This is Victoria in essence. The building of the Victorian Embankment for the Queen's Jubilee in 1850 led to the draining of this marshland and the creation of a new city centre, eventually leading to the realisation of the Palace of Westminster, the House of Parliament here, and then Buckingham Palace being bought by the royal family and Aston Webb, creating a kind of civic topography that connects it to either Mall, to Trafalgar Square, etc. So this is built. This is being built, and there's something else happening down there. In effect, this is what we built, and I'm going to show you this is a kind of mimetic method. It evolved through model making, but in effect, the prison that existed on the site in the middle of the marshland, which the Catholic Church bought at the point at which the hierarchy was re-established in England and they needed a space for a cathedral, is not oriented east-west on cardinal orientation because it's built on the foundations of the ruins of the old prison. And it was paid for by John Francis Bentley building a series of streets of apartment blocks, which then became Vauxhall Bridge Road and establishes a kind of civic grain. And put very simply, what I was looking to do was to try, in a kind of fictional way, to extend this grain across Victoria Street so that what we built feels like it's part of a pre-existing city quarter, almost to the extent that these modernist buildings which were being refurbished feel like they were added after us. This is the Nova development, which isn't very popular. And this is an office building and a library that we're building at the moment. So this is the stuff that's built off residential building, offices, library, etc., houses of parliament. So this is a rhythmic relationship, partly mathematics. In this case, has to do with a structural grid, a 9 by 12 structural grid. Coincidentally, that is the size of the blocks of around about 24 meters of the mansion blocks that Bentley built, and that has to do with the London Building Acts derived from the Fire of London. So it has to do with travel distances. I mean, very, very banal, but part of the discipline of architecture. As well as there being a kind of phenomenological attitude towards spatiality, there is this inevitable, I think, drive as an architect to seek form, for something to have a kind of geometric perfection. The problem being, I would argue that when that operates without relationship to nature or ornament or ecology or sustainability or energy, there's a whole kind of range of words one could use depending upon where you sit within the kind of artistic or scientific edges of architecture. The facade of the office building opens, and it has solar fins which get closer together as they go up the building, and thus they get less deep, because otherwise they would cast themselves into shadow. And the effect of this is a form of entasis. It also means that the building can be operated in a kind of mixed mode, so it has air conditioning, but you can also use the fact that the facade opens in the future when electric cars replace the noise and smog of the fossil fuel vehicles. So the longevity of the building is 3 times as long. So a standard building like this is kind of designed to last about 50 years, and this has a 150-year lifespan built into it. So I'm kind of touching on these overarching theme of energy and ecology that you guys have been looking at. But what I'm really keen to do is to kind of place this into the culture of architecture itself. And if we are, as people are suggesting, going to, in 25 years' time, not be building many more buildings, then our buildings need to last a lot longer. And therefore, the relationships between civic monuments and the background uses of buildings need not only to be attuned, I think, but they also need to become a kind of discourse. So this public artwork, which replaces the scar of brickwork of the existing building we demolished, is an attempt to bring to the surface, working with Blaise Luxembourg, the brilliant photographic artist, a kind of ornamenta of ecological ethics. It exhibits extreme modesty and decorum. It's not mocking the 60s building. It's trying to find a way to spatialize something. So at the point at which you enter the apartment building, the images of this, or the series of images of the forest, coalesce into a space. Otherwise, it's kind of texture, noise, visual noise, pixelation. And this is the space between the 2 buildings, so this is very fuzzy, where a kind of wit, I guess, is at play. Really, the best way to understand this is part of the city, I think. The rhythmic facade of the building. The piers are closer together at the bottom, so that when you're in closer proximity to people on their balconies, they have privacy, and as they get taller, as the building gets taller, they part, but there's always enough of them, so you don't need to use comfort cooling to use fossil fuels to cool the building. So it's a kind of ecological, psychological screen in imitation of the Cadoro. This wasn't a conscious process so much as, I think, a kind of what John Keats, the poet, called a kind of negative capability, i.e. the capacity to hold in balance in your mind contradictions of modernity and tradition and doubt. I'm going to try and run through a few more of these projects very quickly. This is the library, which is now on site. In effect, if this stuff is kind of too tall and some of this stuff is too small, we're seeking to make a kind of middle ground city. It's riddled with underground constraints, sewers. So the draining of Victoria led to this kind of new infrastructure. The train station led to the creation of a tube network. The River Tyburn is canalised underneath the site. And we've had the project in the office for over a decade, and eventually we've ended up with this configuration. Went through various other iterations. And I suppose what we've been looking for is a kind of solar architecture, which is also civic, and where the screen of the south facade works in concert with artworks as you move through the section of the building. Actually, we had a glitch. The public's demand for this building to be the library, and for the planners that it be naturally ventilated, was extremely difficult to achieve on a south-facing site at the junction of a series of roads with lots and lots of noise. And in fact, a few years ago, what we decided to do instead was to partly the kind of economics of housing in the city as well, would be that this is an office building and the library drifts to the hinterland of the site, but the centre of this pedestrian route. And because it's east and north facing, it's possible for it to be naturally ventilated, and so on a quiet route. So this office is in kind of concert. It's kind of halfway between this abstract stuff and this figurative layer of the city. There's lots and lots of bits and pieces of technology popping up, draft relief shaft, vents, and what have you. There's a 1.5 metre drop across the site. So this is the hinterland of Frank Matcham's theatre. This is the muff designed landscape. And this is a listed facade of a pawnbrokers that we're putting back. So as well as the kind of being a kind of ethically oriented environmental project, there's an attempt to create a kind of connection between foreground and hinterland by intensive model making and sketching. So that you enter the library, go up a grand stair, and it's all going to be made of engineered timber because in effect it's setting on top of tube tunnels and sewers. And it's a library for children's books and for music. It's a music library, so the possibility of creating a grand piano nobile at first floor that allows performances to occur and readings to occur has been very happily embraced by the client. This is it on Sunday. We've just finished a slip form of the lift shaft of the building at the rear. Another building around the corner, Coroner's Court. Used to drive horse and carts in like this. This is the morgue, a mortuary at the rear. Kind of what Joseph Brickvat calls kind of, it's a bit kind of Beatrix Potter, late Victorian, if you know what I mean. An attempt to make the civic institutions of the city deal with private grief in a public manner. So it's kind of homely and domestic, but of course it's a place which has behind it a kind of highly functional mortuary. It's typified by a kind of edicular attention to furniture and the human figure within this civic setting. Faience tiles on a fireplace, walnut-lined, vaulted coroner's courtroom. It is very close to the kind of Anglo-Catholic and Roman Catholic world of the cathedral. You find this kind of niche architecture everywhere. In fact, that's our proposals. So the project, this is built, it's a garden of remembrance for the victims of the Grenfell fire tragedy and others whose cases are heard in the building. And then a new garden here for uses of family members. So effectively you enter the building like this. You're unfortunate enough to be called by the police. You go into the mortuary, you view the body in the kind of, Scandinavian noir fashion on a slab. It's quite scientific and alienating. You might then come out and use the garden of remembrance. If you return 6 weeks later on average to hear the inquest findings, you go into a meeting room. This is a private garden. This is expanded office space for the people working in the building, a press room, ancillary spaces. Go up the grand stair into this double height vaulted new juror's room and coroner's room, which has a kind of mimetic understanding of the character of the existing architecture. So it's an attempt to not make it second rate, but to evolve the language of the courtroom or the typology of the courtroom. So there's an ancillary room for a secretary, coroner, jury room, or small courtroom or large courtroom. So this is the grand stair, that's the window seat. And it's conceived of as a kind of extension or edicular scalar evolution of the Garden of Remembrance itself, which kind of condenses the form of the building down to this series of seats, a Victorian fountain that we bought on eBay, and this monument. This is all rough concrete. Within the niche, it's polished concrete. So there's this kind of strange, ghostly effect of registering your own figure when you're there. So it's a kind of memento mori. And the building itself is deliberately very mute and secondary to not confuse people in extreme states of distress. It has no fenestration on the north elevation because of the problem of paparazzi photography and noise and overlooking generally. It's fenestrated to the west, and there's a new garden of remembrance. Sorry, garden of reflection, as we call it, for the residents, for the occupants. And working with the stained glass artist Brian Clark, the buildings to be made of engineered timber, again, largely to do with contractual issues about if there was ever a national emergency, the Queen's Corner in West London takes control of anything happening within Westminster or near Westminster. So the contractors have to leave site within 2 hours, and that's why the building will be prefabricated and erected, and thus there's no wet trades that they have to go away at short notice. They can. A stone facade that takes the striations and the rhythms of the Victorian facade, and the paler elements will be rough, and the creamier elements will have a residue of iron ore within the Jura limestone, a kind of ghostly imitation of the rhythm of the facade. And this adicular character reappears in the room within. This is the family waiting room as a kind of device to allow doors to occur in a corridor between the two buildings. It's conceived of as two buildings, in effect, so there's stone lining to the corridor of the new building. And that's the view from the coroner's chair in the old courtroom, looking back, as it were, into the corridor between the two buildings. And in effect, this south-facing glazed window is there to stop you looking at the kind of raft of chiller plants on the roof of the mortuary, inevitable when you're refrigerating bodies. There's a step in the section to do with the misalignment of certain parts of the facade, at which point this figure of the daffodil, this is the view effectively of leaving the coroner's court. You suddenly have this fragment of the whole. And Brian's insistent that it's a kind of secular prayer, having kind of encountered and used the building on many occasions with beloved friends of his who've died. The attempt to turn something municipal into something which is a kind of civic, sacred space. I mean, not religious as in Corbusier's terms, but sacred, having some kind of the gravity of something which is utterly functional. The stained glass here is to, as I said, to stop people photographing you. But on the other hand, as this kind of coincidence at the end of the day, the summing up of the judge occurs with a coincidence of the natural light through a tree in the garden of reflection outside, and the pictorial content of the artwork kind of come together, hopefully in a moment of kind of heightened consciousness, because that's the point at which you find out the jury's verdicts about the cause of death of your loved one. And we're toying at the moment with the idea of actually making the building a kind of poem itself, whereby Wordsworth's beautiful poem about London might become part of the architecture, might be carved on the stone at certain points. I've realized I'm kind of running out of time. What I might do is very quickly, just to demonstrate that in my terminology, civic does not mean simply town hall or a building that is next to an office building, but is also part of the domestic territory, something which this is a scheme we've just got consent for, goes on site in the autumn in Hackney. A 60s tower, lower block, and a 3-story car park, which we're removing and replacing with a new building here and 2 new buildings. So in effect, the kind of road engineering, functionalist discipline, methodology of modernism has wrecked the city. We assumed it was bomb damage. In fact, this is the site here. It's mostly this type of kind of early Victorian housing. In fact, it was demolished in the 1960s by the council. And it's a kind of project manager's idea of rather than refurbishing Georgian and Victorian housing stock, to house people very simply and to emphasize the car. So that's the site as we found it. And you couldn't get something which is less civic, whereby the ground is a kind of rift between the traditional city and this new type of housing. So the car park in the basement is ventilated, and so there's literally a gap between the two. You enter the flats over this hump. There's a series of rail lines running beneath the site. So rather than spending more money to dig down, they dug down, but then you have to rise up to get to the building. And in essence, this collage is a kind of an attempt to say, well, if the best housing in London at that period was slightly later was the Barbican, but it in itself suffers from this kind of misuse of mimetic language, whereby the fact that it's a car park at ground floor is disguised as it being a Barbican, i.e. a fortification. Actually, if one took Rossi's analogical method seriously and looked at the way he deals with the ground plane of the Galatasaray housing in Milan, if we could combine the best aspects of Italian rationalist, postmodernist analogical thinking and the best aspects of Anglo-Saxon modernism, we might end up with a better form of architecture. So it's a kind of extension of the modernist project of what exists, a critique of it. It's not a rejection of it. It's an attempt, however, to create a new form of urban composition whereby the lessons of postmodern figure and ground and our aversion now to car-based road engineering technological systems of building might find a language of an evolved modern architecture, both at ground floor and at the top. So this is the ground plane. This is existing, this is existing. We're filling in the ground plane with the spoil from the creation of the deeper basements for these new buildings. Planting and landscaping are kind of integrated into a series of play spaces. There are still some car parking spaces for the elderly people who still have cars. As they die out, these will be filled in by trees. This building acts as a kind of gateway into this estate. In effect, this is simply aligned with the road, and this is perpendicular to this building, or parallel to this building and perpendicular to this road. The effect is to create a kind of Campaglio force perspectival threshold between the two buildings, whereby that which was hidden and occluded and not part of the city is now part of the city. The language of concrete panels and infill brickwork is used, and hopefully it's more insulated, so it's more sophisticated, hopefully. The thermal performance of the building goes coincidentally with attention to detail, so that the windows are no higher than 850 off the ground millimeters. So you can look out if you're in a wheelchair when you get that condition. If you want the windows to open, you have to have a kind of silly glazing bar, or people fall out, or you just densify the balustrade at that moment. Otherwise, it runs around the facade of the building as a kind of ornament. It's thickened at the edges. There's a series of thresholds both at the ground and in the domestic territory. So it's not just object and city, it's city as thresholds. The arch within the horizontal plane of this stage for parties is a family room or community room here. It's kind of echoed in the vaults of the corner of the flats. Now, interestingly, I just want to conclude by slightly disagreeing with some things which Daniel Barber and Barnabas Calder have been saying about concrete. Within the London plan, there are a series of contradictions at the moment in the building regulations, whereby in order to limit fossil fuel, apartments have to have lots and lots and lots of natural light. And that, when you factor in temperature rises over the next 25 years, means that we have to project a huge increase in solar gain to buildings. And the only way to deal with that is to expose concrete and to allow the inherent coolth within the thermal mass of the building at night when you open your windows in the summer to cool the building down, and for that the coolth to slowly resonate throughout the day. And then the building is overclad with a thick insulation and of brickwork and concrete as well to further protect it. It's impossible to achieve this with lightweight engineered timber. This is the colonnade that includes a bus stop and children's play area. This is mimetic of that building. Smaller building, two types of balconies. And so I'm just finishing now. I just want to conclude by saying that kind of environmental science of architecture, which the Martin Centre, I think Martin was very, very clear at the Oxford conference that he felt that architecture needed to have theory. And that theory, I think within a kind of scientific Russell Group university like Cambridge, it always tends towards attempting to be empirical and something which can be quantified. Unfortunately, that approach to architecture has produced not particularly, what's the word, hospitable or decorous architecture. And to kind of just finish with Avarauto again, he said back in the 1930s that the problem with functionalism as a dogma was that it didn't go far enough, and that what was needed was a psychological and a cultural functionalism. And that, in essence, is my project as an architect. When we finished the project, we overlaid our plan onto these 19th century street pattern. What we realized, this is kind of occurring intuitively, instinctually, is that when you attempt to introduce a new rhythm, this colonnade along the north facade, what we were really doing, it's at 5 meter centers that allows vehicles to come in and out, and it's imitating the column grid of the building. We've actually imitated the party wall line of the Georgian houses. So it's a kind of ghost of the city. It's an unfinished project of modernity, but it's also a critique of modern architecture. Okay, that's me. Thanks very much.